Imagine opening an ancient tome bound in human skin. What leaps out at you from the pages is not dusty history, but a mad carnival dripping with pus and gold. Do you hear that sound? It's not the wind. It's the crunch of bones under the weight of fashionable shoes, the squeal of a pig in a judge's robe, and the whisper of lice feasting on the powder of a royal wig. Wipe the sweat from your brow. You're not in a museum. You're in the cesspool of human civilization, which we used to call the Great Past. Forget everything you were lied to in school. Forget the noble knights in shining armor. They stank so bad they killed flies, and they didn't take off their armor even when they were sick with dysentery. Forget the beautiful ladies. Their snow-white skin was merely a layer of poisonous lead, hiding the smallpox scars and the parasites crawling beneath. We're used to thinking of ourselves as the pinnacle of evolution, and they were simply unwashed ancestors. But what if I told you their madness was far more logical than ours? That their fears were tangible, and their survival methods would make you cower in a corner and beg for mercy within 5 minutes of being in good old England. Make yourself comfortable. Close the windows. Light a candle, though it won't help you in this world. We're beginning the countdown into an abyss where facts are more terrifying than any fiction, and reality smells worse than any nightmare. Welcome to the real, unfiltered, bloody, and absurd world of the past. Let's go. Imagine for a moment that you are a nobleman, or even a beautiful lady in 14th century Europe. You wake up in your castle, and servants bring you a luxurious dress made of the finest wool or silk, embroidered with gold thread. But here's the problem. There's a greasy stain on the sleeve from yesterday's venison ham, and the dress itself has acquired, to put it mildly, a stale aroma from long feasts. Where will you send this precious garment? To the laundry, of course. But how will they restore its shine and cleanliness? My friend, sit back, because the answer may make you wince. The Mainminister, proper of the Middle Ages, through all-purpose bleach, stain remover, and even toothpaste was ordinary human urine. Yes, that's not a joke or an exaggeration. Back when chemistry didn't yet know the words surfactants or enzymes, people used what was literally at hand. And they did so with a truly scientific, albeit intuitive, approach. The fact is that urine decomposes when left to stand, producing ammonia. And ammonia is a powerful alkaline compound that breaks down fats and removes even the most stubborn stains. The washing process looked like a scene from a horror movie to a modern person. Large vats were used to collect raw materials, sometimes even purchased from entire villages. Clothes were soaked in them. And laundresses, usually the poorest women in town, would trample the laundry with their bare feet for hours, knocking out the dirt. This was called fulling. The most astonishing thing is that after this spa, the fabrics actually turned snow white. The white collars of priests and the dazzling shirts of kings owe their cleanliness to this sharp, caustic substance. But washing wasn't the only thing. Medieval people had a very practical view of the world. If something worked on clothes, why not apply it to themselves? Imagine a battlefield. Mud, the clang of iron, screams. A knight receives a deep cut from a sword. There are no antibiotics, antiseptics as we know them wouldn't appear for another half-millennium. What does a field doctor or a soldier do? They use their own urine as an antiseptic. And oddly enough, this often prevented immediate blood poisoning, since fresh urine in a healthy body is relatively sterile, and the ammonia it contains killed some surface bacteria. This was written about in medical treatises of the time. If you are wounded in battle, wash the wound with your own moisture, and it will heal faster. And now the most piquant part: cosmetology and oral hygiene. If you wanted a pearly white smile like a Hollywood star, well, by the standards of 1200, the best advice of the time was to rinse your mouth with, you guessed it. It was believed to strengthen gums and whiten enamel. Even the great Romans once purchased urine from Portugal, considering it the most concentrated and effective, and this tradition survived well into the Middle Ages. Tanners simply couldn't exist without this golden resource. To make the leather for your fashionable boots soft and pliable, they soaked it in huge vats of urine mixed with dog excrement. The smell in such neighborhoods was so bad that birds would fall in flight, but at least the gentlemen could show off their finest gloves. Life in that era was permeated with smells and substances that shock us today. But for them, it represented the highest level of cleanliness and self-care. They weren't dirty, they simply utilized all natural resources to the fullest, turning waste into gold for everyday use. But if you think using urine is the strangest thing to happen in medieval society, wait a minute, the justice system of those times was even more insane, and those in the dock might not even be human. And it gets even more interesting. Imagine a courtroom in 15th century France. A judge in his robes is gravely adjusting his wig. The prosecutor is reading the charges, the defense attorney is sweating to acquit his client, and onlookers are whispering in the courtroom. Everything is as usual, with one small exception. In the dock, bound hand and foot, or, more accurately, hooves, sits a pig. And this isn't a metaphor for a bad person, it's a real, grunting pig, who yesterday had the misfortune to wander into a closet and eat a neighbor's baby or simply ruin a valuable church vault. My friend, welcome to the world of medieval jurisprudence, where the concept of personal responsibility extended to all living things. If you thought that in the Middle Ages, animals were simply beaten with sticks for their misdeeds, then you greatly underestimate the passion of that time for order and the letter of the law. In Europe, there were hundreds of official animal trials, from bulls and horses to rats and even locusts. Why such complications? It stems from a deeply held belief that the entire world is God's order, and if any creature violates it, it must be punished by law to restore global harmony. A pig that kills a person has committed murder. Therefore, it's imperative to follow procedure. Pig trials were the most common because these animals roamed the streets of cities at that time completely freely, working as living garbage collectors. One of the most famous cases occurred in 1386 in the city of Falaise. A pig gnawed off the face and arm of a child, causing his death. What did the city do? It appointed a trial. The pig was assigned a state attorney. He tried to prove that his client had acted in a state of passion or simply through carelessness, but the evidence was too strong. The sentence was harsh. The pig was sentenced to death by hanging in the town square. But the most insane details were the details. Before the execution, the pig was dressed in human clothing. A jacket and pants were pulled over it, and white gloves were placed on its hooves to emphasize its status as a criminal. The execution was public, and other pigs were herded to witness the sad end of their fellow pig and draw conclusions. But what if the criminal wasn't just one pig, but an entire swarm of rats that had devoured the entire grain harvest? This is where the ecclesiastical court came into play. Since rats couldn't be caught and hanged individually, they were summoned to court by subpoena. A bailiff would go out into the field and loudly read a document ordering the rodents to appear for a hearing on a certain date. There's a well-known case of lawyer Barthélemy de Chassenay, who made a career defending rats. When his furry clients failed to appear in court on the appointed day, he claimed the summons was too general and not all the rats had heard it. The trial was adjourned. The second time, he argued that the route to court was too dangerous for rats. Cats lay in wait for them on the streets, and the law guaranteed the defendant safe passage. The judges, scratching their heads, acknowledged this argument and acquitted the rats, as the plaintiff had failed to guarantee their safety from the cats. To us, this sounds like the ravings of a madman or the plot of an absurdist comedy. But for people in the Middle Ages, it was vital. They believed that if a guilty animal was not convicted according to all the rules, a curse would fall on the city. The death penalty for an animal was a purification ritual. Animals were imprisoned in the same prisons as people. The prison keeper received the same money for their food as for ordinary prisoners. Cows bitten by rabid dogs were tried for aiding the devil. In this strange, cruel, yet logical world, the line between man and nature was so thin that even a rooster could be burned at the stake for allegedly laying an egg, which was considered witchcraft and a harbinger of the basilisk's arrival. You may laugh at judges hanging pigs in their pants, but behind this lies a society desperately trying to find meaning in chaos. While strict law reigned in the courts, fashion was dominated by utter madness, sometimes even physical deformity. But this is only the beginning. Imagine a narrow medieval street, littered with garbage and sewage. A young dandy strides along it, swaying slightly with self-importance. He's dressed in a luxurious caftan, but all your attention is drawn to his feet. It looks as if he's wearing skis or the beaks of giant prehistoric birds, not shoes. The toes of his shoes extend forward half a meter, curling upward in bizarre spirals. Just to take a step without falling, the poor fellow has to lift his knees high, reminiscent of a heron in a swamp. My friend, welcome to the era of the Poulaina shoe that has become a symbol of the most ridiculous and uncomfortable vanity in human history. If you think that modern platform sneakers or skinny jeans are a sacrifice for fashion, then the medieval dandies of the 14th and 15th centuries would simply laugh in your face if they weren't busy tying their shoes to their knees. The name poulains comes from the French soulier's La Poulaine shoes in the Polish style. It's believed that this trend originated in Poland and instantly infected the entire European aristocracy. What was the secret? It's simple and painfully familiar. Size mattered. The longer your shoes toe, the higher your social status. It got to the point that kings had to issue special decrees, sumptuary laws to bring some order to this chaos. Knights and barons were allowed to wear toes to feet long about 60 centimeters, common nobles 1 foot long, and commoners, well, they weren't supposed to stand out at all, so their beaks were purely symbolic. But wealthy merchants and the gilded youth ignored the decrees. Their shoes sometimes grew so long that it was physically impossible to walk in them. So what did they do? The solution was purely medieval in its ingenuity. The long toes were stuffed with hay or moss to keep their shape, and the most extreme tips were tied to the knees with thin silk laces or gold chains. Can you imagine the scene? A man walking, his shoes literally strapped to his feet. But this fashion also had a dark, even scandalous side. The church was furious. Preachers called poulains the claws of the devil and claimed that it was because of these shoes that God brought the Black Death plague upon Europe. Why? Firstly, it was impossible to kneel for prayer in such shoes. The toes got in the way and touched the floor. This was considered the height of disrespect for the Almighty. Secondly, the long, phallic shapes of poulains hinted at very immodesty. Young men loved to play with these toes under the table during feasts, brushing up against the ladies, which was considered the height of indecency and borderline flirtation. The most absurd things happened during war. Knights, who followed fashion even on campaign, often found themselves trapped by their own shoes. History has preserved evidence of the Battle of Nicopolis 1396, where French knights were forced to chop off the toes of their poulains with swords right on the battlefield. Why? Because they could neither run nor maneuver, they tripped over their own fashion, becoming easy prey for the enemy. Imagine, a great battle is underway, the fate of the Christian army is being decided, and the army's elite is frantically hacking away at their shoes just to keep their heads above water. Hygiene in poulains was also a separate issue. Leather or velvet shoes without soles, as we understand it today, instantly absorbed all the street liquid which, as we recall from the first point, consisted of more than just rainwater. To protect expensive shoes, they wore patent wooden lasts on high stands on top. The result was a layered cake: a sock, a shoe, a knee chain, and a wooden sole underneath. By the end of the 15th century, fashion, thankfully, shifted to bare paws as shoes of incredible width, but poulains will forever remain in history as an example of the suffering a person will endure to show their neighbor, "My status is greater than yours." But if uncomfortable shoes were merely external torture, what was happening inside the human mouth was a true nightmare, one that people believed in for centuries, trying the most insane methods to escape the pain. The following fact will surely surprise you. Imagine, it's the dead of night in a medieval hut. You wake up to a throbbing, jaw-splitting pain. You have no painkiller, no dentist appointment, and the only remedy is strong ale or prayer. You go to the mirror if you have one, which is unlikely, and try to figure out who's gnawing at the inside of your tooth. The answer, for someone of that time, was obvious and scientifically proven. A treacherous toothworm has taken up residence in your jaw. My friend, the toothworm theory is perhaps one of the most persistent and terrifying misconceptions in the history of medicine. It persisted for thousands of years, from ancient Egypt to the late 18th century, but it was in the Middle Ages that it reached its apogee. People believed that tooth decay wasn't the result of poor hygiene or a love of sweets, which were rare back then, but the work of a tiny but voracious creature, similar to an earthworm, that gnawed tunnels in the enamel and wiggled its tail, causing that unbearable throbbing. Why did they believe this? It's simple. When a tooth eventually fell out or was extracted, the nerve endings and blood vessels inside the root often appeared as tiny, pale threads. "There it is!" exclaimed the doctor. "Look how it wriggles!" In reality, these were remnants of the pulp, but for the terrified patient, they were irrefutable proof of the parasite's presence. Methods for combating this demon were worthy of the Inquisition. If you had a toothache, you were offered two options. The first was smoking it out. The patient was seated on a chair, their head covered with a thick cloth, and a pot of hot coals placed under their nose, onto which henbane seeds, an extremely poisonous and hallucinogenic plant, were dropped. It was believed that the acrid smoke would cause the worm to suffocate and crawl out. In reality, the patient simply experienced violent hallucinations, fell into a semi-conscious state, and temporarily lost all pain. When they came to, they were shown charred henbane seeds, which, when heated, burst and released white shoots resembling tiny worms. Look, the healer would say, it's out. If smoking didn't help, a second method, cauterization, was used. Boiling oil was poured into the hole in the tooth, or a red-hot needle was inserted. The logic was ironclad. The worm fears fire, so we'll roast it. Needless to say, after such a procedure, the person often lost not only the worm, but also consciousness, and sometimes even half their face due to infection. But who performed this treatment? Forget people in white coats. Your dentist was a blacksmith or a traveling barber. The tooth extraction process was a public spectacle at fairs. To prevent the screams of the unfortunate person from scaring off other customers, a band always stood nearby. Drummers pounded tambourines, and trumpeters blew horns with all their might, drowning out the crunching of bones and cries of pain. Professional tooth extractors often wore necklaces of extracted teeth as proof of their skill. The more teeth on the neck, the more experienced the artist. Interestingly, the rich suffered from the worm far more often than the poor. Why? The answer lies in their diet. Peasants ate coarse rye bread, vegetables, and porridge, which naturally removed plaque. But the aristocracy adored sweets, honey, and soft white flour. Queen Elizabeth I, though this was a later era, the root cause of the problem is the same, had completely black teeth in her old age, which she tried to hide behind a fan. But in the Middle Ages, black, rotten teeth were sometimes even considered a sign of wealth. Look, he has money for sugar, he's so rich that his teeth have rotted. Medieval people lived in constant fear of invisible enemies within their bodies. But while toothache was a private matter, family conflicts were sometimes aired publicly in a way that would make modern no-holds-barred fighting seem like child's play. Moving on. Imagine you've been married to your husband for 10 years, and suddenly he declares you're no good at housekeeping, and you respond by harping on him about every coin you've spent drunk. These days, this would end in a visit to a psychologist or a tedious divorce court over the division of the cat. But in 15th century Germany, the law had a more dynamic solution. If there are no witnesses, insufficient evidence, and both spouses swear they're right, the judge shrugged and said, well, let God judge you in the pit. My friend, this is not a metaphor. Welcome to a courtroom duel between spouses. In the Middle Ages, it was believed that higher powers would not allow an innocent person to be defeated, so physical combat was considered a perfectly legitimate legal tool. But since men were objectively stronger than women, the law introduced truly surreal adjustments to this scuffle to even the playing field. What did it look like? A round pit, waist deep, was dug in the town square. The man was lowered into the pit, one arm tied to his torso so he couldn't use it. He was given a short wooden club in his free hand. The woman remained above ground, completely free to move. Her weapon was a simple linen sack or the long sleeve of a dress into which a heavy stone weighing a couple of pounds was sewn. It was a spectacle worthy of the world's finest arenas. The man, confined to the pit, and his tied arm, attempted to reach his wife with his club if she came too close. The woman circled the edge of the pit like a bird of prey, swinging her stone flail and trying to hit her husband on the head or shoulders. The rules were spelled out in meticulous detail in the fencing treatises of the time. For example, in the famous Code of Wallerstein, if a man touched the edge of the pit 3 times, he was declared the loser. If a woman fell or dropped the sack 3 times, she was defeated. But most often, the fight raged until one of the participants surrendered completely or was killed. The most horrific part of this story wasn't the fight itself, but the aftermath. Since the loser was considered abandoned by God, this automatically meant they were guilty of perjury before God. If a woman lost, she was buried alive in the very pit where her husband had just stood. If a man lost, he was led to the chopping block or hanged. A judicial duel wasn't just a fight, it was a way to finally settle the matter in a family dispute. Spectators, including children and the elderly, placed bets. For a medieval person, this wasn't an act of barbarity, it was an act of absolute justice. If you're right, why did you lose? The logic was ironclad. Such fights were rare, but the memory of them lived on for decades, forcing spouses to reconsider whether it was worth escalating a domestic dispute to the point of formal charges. Life in the Middle Ages was a constant struggle for survival and honor, and even the family hearth could suddenly turn into a battlefield. But while people at least tried to find the truth in matters of personal hygiene and beauty, they voluntarily created problems for themselves that literally teemed with life. And it gets even more interesting. Imagine a ball in a luxurious French chateau. Ladies in silk, gentlemen in embroidered doublets, the sound of a lute, the scent of precious incense wafting through the air. You approach the most captivating countess to invite her to dance, and suddenly notice a fat, well-fed louse slowly and confidently crawling across her tall, artfully styled snow-white wig. But the countess doesn't even bat an eyelid. She simply takes out an elegant golden wand, resembling a long knitting needle, and gracefully inserts it deep into the depths of her hair, delightfully scratching her scalp. My friend, welcome to the era when a wig was not just an accessory, but a truly autonomous ecosystem. If you thought the fashion for huge, powdered hair was all about cleanliness and aesthetics, I hasten to disappoint you. It was a haven for parasites, something modern biologists could write dissertations about. It all began when personal hygiene during certain periods of the Middle Ages and early modern period, the line between which was extremely blurred in everyday life, was considered almost sinful. Water supposedly opened the pores to the plague, so people preferred not to wash for months. Their own hair quickly turned into greasy tow, so wigs became the solution. But what wigs? To construct the tower on the head we see in portraits, not only human hair was used. Horsehair, sheep's wool, and even tow were also used. But the most interesting thing is the glue. To keep the whole structure from falling apart, it was thickly coated with lard or mutton fat. On top, everything was generously dusted with powder, usually wheat or rice flour. Now imagine, on your head, a kilogram of wool soaked in stale animal fat and dusted with flour. It's the perfect smorgasbord for insects. Wigs were home not only to lice but also to fleas, and sometimes, if a wig wasn't removed for a long time, and they could be worn for weeks, with only minor adjustments, even small mice, attracted by the smell of lard and flour, would build a nest. Fleas were such a pervasive problem that they spawned an entire industry of killer accessories. Ladies wore flea traps around their necks or belts, small carved boxes made of ivory or gold, each containing a piece of cloth soaked in honey and animal blood. The idea was that a flea, attracted by the scent, would jump into the box and become attached to the honey. It was considered the height of elegance to give the lady of your heart a golden flea trap. And what to do with the itch? That's what those scratchers were for, long sticks made of bone or silver. At social gatherings, it was perfectly normal to interrupt a conversation to slide one of these sticks under your wig and calm the unbearable squirming of the insects. Wigs were heavy, causing terrible headaches and skin conditions. Constant contact with grease and powder caused the scalp to break out in sores, which were again treated with poultices based on what we discussed in the first point. A vicious circle of medieval self-care. When the wig was finally removed for the night, it was often hung on a special stand, with a saucer of poison or a trap placed nearby to prevent the wig's inhabitants from scattering throughout the bedroom. But the next morning, the ecosystem was placed back on the head, dusted with a fresh layer of flour, hiding the gray film of dirt, and the person was once again ready to shine in society. Living in such a cloud of powder, grease, and biting insects was the norm even for kings. But while in your castle you could at least hope for a private bed even with bedbugs, on a journey an even more intimate and dubious experience awaited you. Let's move on. Imagine you're an exhausted traveler who spent the entire day in the saddle in pouring rain. Finally, the lights of an inn appear on the horizon. You dream of only one thing: kicking off your boots, eating a bowl of hot soup, and falling into a deep sleep. You go inside, pay for the night, and the innkeeper graciously shows you to your room. You open the door and see a huge bed, on which 3 bearded men, an old woman in a cap, and what appears to be a traveling merchant with a basket of chickens are already snoring peacefully. My friend, if you value your personal space, you would have had a hard time in the Middle Ages. The concept of a private bed was as unimaginable a luxury as a private jet is today. In ordinary taverns and inns, you weren't buying a bed, but a place in line for a mattress. And it's not just poverty that's at issue here. Medieval consciousness was collective. Loneliness was considered suspicious. If you sleep alone, it means you have something to hide or are up to no good. So people slept in a tangle. Family members, servants, guests, and even random passersby would cram into a single bed like sardines. This created a level of intimacy that, by modern standards, was incredible. You could wake up nose to nose with someone whose name you didn't even know. And this was considered perfectly normal etiquette. There were even unspoken rules of behavior in a shared bed. For example, it was considered polite to lie still, not to thrash about in your sleep, and, if you absolutely had to turn over, to do so as delicately as possible so as not to wake the other 6 bedmates. But comfort was the last thing to worry about. The main concern was the smaller roommates. Straw mattresses, rarely changed sometimes for years, were the perfect breeding ground for bedbugs, fleas, and lice. People became so accustomed to bites that they considered them an inevitable part of life. Even in wealthy homes, servants would warm their master's bed with special hot water bottles filled with coals before bed, not only for warmth, but also to drive any insects deeper into the straw while the master fell asleep. There was another strange custom: wardrobe beds. In some regions of Europe, people slept in wooden boxes with doors. Why? First, it helped conserve heat. There was no heating. Second, it provided at least some protection from rats, which scurried around the room at night in search of food. And third, it created the illusion of privacy in an otherwise crowded house. Interestingly, it was in these shared beds that the most incredible rumors and gossip were born. Night was a time of whispers. Travelers exchanged news from distant lands, merchants discussed prices, and peasants listened to tales. Sleep was a social act. Of course, canopy beds existed for the nobility. But don't be fooled, the canopy wasn't just for show. The thick fabric protected the sleepers from insects and rat droppings that could fall from the ceiling. Ceilings were often simply planks or straw. The bed was a small fortress within the house. Living in close contact with other people's bodies and their smells was everyday life. But while you could at least relax in bed, on the battlefield, encased in tons of steel, you had to perform physiological tasks that would seem the height of acrobatics and humiliation to a modern person. The following fact will surely surprise you. Imagine you're a noble knight, clad in the latest Milanese armor. You're decked out in shining cuirass, greaves, bracers, and a heavy visored helmet. You look terrifying, like a steel war machine. But there's one detail the heroic ballads never mention. You've been wearing this armor for 10 hours, the heat is unbearable outside, and you've just had a hearty lunch of fatty pork washed down with a couple of liters of ale. And then your body gives you a clear signal. It's time. My friend, the problem of toileting in armor is perhaps the most mundane and yet most heroic challenge of medieval chivalry. If you thought the knight had a special vent or an emergency P button, I must disappoint you. The reality was far harsher and smellier. Let's start with the fact that donning full plate armor took anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, and it was impossible to do alone. You needed the help of at least 2 squires to tighten the straps, rivet the pins, and adjust the plates. Removing it all quickly, especially in the heat of battle or during a ceremonial parade, was a physically impossible task. So what did a noble sir do when the call of nature became unbearable? There were few options, and none of them were particularly romantic. The first and most common method was to pee all in. Yes, that's right. Most knights, in the heat of battle, simply relieved themselves right in their armor. Beneath the steel plates, there was always a quilted underarmor gambeson, a thick jacket, and trousers made of linen or cotton, stuffed with tow or horsehair. This fabric acted like a giant diaper. A mixture of sweat, dust, and natural secretions created a hostile environment inside the armor, corroding the skin to the point of ulceration and causing terrible diaper rash. After battle, the knight was literally shaken out of his steel cocoon, and the odor emanating from the hero could knock even a horse off its feet. The second method is technical. In some armor designs, especially those of the later period, the groin area was protected not by a solid plate, but by a chainmail skirt or a special codpiece secured with ties. If the knight was not in combat, but say, on guard duty, he might attempt to untie some of the fastenings. But imagine trying to untangle leather laces with frozen or trembling fingers while 25 to 30 kilograms of iron pressed down on you. This often ended in failure. Now imagine a protracted siege. Knights might remain fully armored for weeks, fearing a surprise attack. Dysentery, the scourge of all armies of the time, was rampant in the camps. For a man in armor, diarrhea was a death sentence, or at least the ultimate humiliation. Historians describe cases where knights died not from the enemy's sword, but from infections spread through abrasions and wounds, which were constantly in contact with the filth inside their armor. But that's not all. The armor itself, from such use, began to rapidly rust from the inside. Urine is an excellent oxidizer. Servants had to spend hours scrubbing the steel with sand, vinegar, and that very substance from the first item on our list to restore the equipment to its former shine. Chivalry in the movies is gleaming armor and fluttering cloaks. Chivalry in reality is hard labor in a tin can that smells like a public toilet that hasn't been cleaned since the last century. But while men suffered from excess weight and physical exhaustion, medieval women sometimes voluntarily exhausted themselves, mistaking hunger for divine revelation. And it gets even more interesting. Imagine a young woman from a noble family in 14th century Italy. Before her on the oak table are dishes that would make any modern gourmet's mouth water. Roast pheasant, fresh bread, cheeses, and wine. But she doesn't touch the food. In fact, she looks at the meat with disgust, and if she's forced to swallow even a morsel, she secretly induces vomiting or exhausts herself with prayers until she faints. She believes that every missed meal brings her closer to the ranks of angels. My friend, we're used to thinking of anorexia as a disease of our time, spawned by glossy magazines and social media. But in the Middle Ages, there existed a phenomenon that historians call anorexia mirabilis, holy anorexia. The only difference is that modern women dream of the catwalk, while medieval women dreamed of a halo. In a society where religion permeated every breath, fasting was considered the primary weapon against the sinful flesh. It was believed that the devil tempted a person through the stomach. Remember the forbidden fruit. Therefore, abstaining from food became the only available way for women to assert their spiritual power in a male-dominated world. If you couldn't be a knight or a priest, you could become a holy martyr who feeds only on the Holy Spirit. The most striking and terrifying example is Saint Catherine of Siena. At the age of 16, she practically stopped eating. Her diet consisted only of raw vegetables and bitter herbs, and later, she switched entirely to holy water and communion. When concerned relatives tried to force-feed her, she would force a plant stem down her throat to purge her stomach. She eventually died at the age of 33, weighing just over 30 kilograms. And she wasn't alone. Hundreds of starving saints across Europe reduced themselves to the state of living skeletons. But behind the religious ecstasy lurked a horrific physiology. Due to extreme emaciation, these women stopped menstruating, which was interpreted at the time as a miracle. Supposedly, their bodies had become so pure that nature no longer had power over them. They began to hallucinate from hunger, which they mistook for divine visions and conversations with angels. The church had a mixed attitude toward this. On the one hand, self-denial was praised. On the other, the Inquisition often suspected such women of having ties to the devil. How can a person live without food? Demons must be feeding them. Therefore, the anorexic saints had to endure humiliating tests. They were locked in empty cells under guard to ensure they weren't secretly eating. The most striking thing is that this voluntary fasting was a form of protest. By refusing food, a girl often avoided an unwanted marriage. No one wanted to marry a saint who was melting before their eyes and dreaming of heaven. This was the only way to gain some control over one's own life, even at the cost of that very life. The life of an adult woman in the Middle Ages was full of prohibitions and self-torture. But if you think childhood back then was a time of pampering and affection, then brace yourself. The infant rearing methods of that time would make today's pediatricians go gray in 5 minutes. Let's continue. Imagine a nursery in a medieval house. You expect to hear a lullaby, see soft swaddling clothes, and the mother's gentle touch. But instead, you see a strange object on the bed, resembling a dense cocoon or even a small log. The baby is wrapped in long strips of linen so tightly that it can't move a finger or even its head. It lies motionless, like a mummy, while the mother calmly goes off to the fields or to run errands, knowing that the child is safe, tied to a special board or simply left in a corner. My friend, if you thought modern parenting methods were strict, then welcome to the era of tight swaddling, which lasted for centuries. In the Middle Ages, it was believed that babies were born and finished, their bodies like soft wax or wet clay. If the limbs were left free, doctors of the time believed the child could grow up crooked, hunchbacked, or worse, crawl on all fours, like an animal. The process of wrapping a person began immediately after birth. The midwife took long strips of cloth and methodically wrapped them around the baby's body, straightening the legs and pinning the arms to the sides. This was believed to be the only way to develop proper posture and a human appearance. The baby was transformed into an immobile bundle. Children spent almost 24 hours a day in this state for the first few months of life. But the most frightening aspect is the practical side of the matter. Medieval mothers were consumed by hard physical labor. They had no strollers, baby monitors, or safe playpens. A tightly swaddled baby was convenient. It could be propped against a wall, placed on a shelf, or even hung on a wall hook to keep pigs, the same ones we mentioned in point 2, or rats, out of reach. The baby couldn't fall, couldn't put anything in its mouth, and couldn't interfere with work. It simply lay there, waiting to be unswaddled for infrequent feedings or meager hygiene. Speaking of hygiene, diapers were changed extremely rarely. Often, Babies lay in their own excrement for hours, even days. Ammonia from urine are familiar from point 1 caused terrible burns and ulcers on delicate skin, but this was considered a necessary evil. To somehow alleviate the suffering, children were sometimes sprinkled with crushed oak bark or ash. The psychological aspect was no less severe. In the Middle Ages, infant mortality rates were so high up to 50% of children died before age 5 that parents subconsciously tried not to become too attached to their infants. They were viewed more as candidates for human development than as individuals. Few cooed at the little log that barely moved. Crying was believed to strengthen the lungs, so cries from the cocoon were often simply ignored. This tradition was so strong that even when medicine began to make its first advances, doctors continued to insist on swaddling, threatening mothers with the possibility that without it, the child might tear its own ligaments or gouge out an eye with its own finger. Only by the end of the 18th century did this practice begin to fade under the onslaught of Enlightenment ideas. Life began in the tight confines of linen ribbons, and this was only the first test of its strength. But if a surviving child fell ill later in life, they were treated to a cure that dwarfed any horrors of swaddling, as a man with a razor and a jar of black worms appeared on the scene. The following fact will surely surprise you. Imagine you have a pain in your side, a fever, or, God forbid, an appendicitis attack. You go to the doctor, but instead of a cozy office with diplomas on the walls, you find yourself in a dimly lit shop that smells of burnt hair, cheap soap, and fresh blood. A pole painted red and white hangs above the door, and on the table are laid out straight razors, dental pliers, and glass jars containing writhing black creatures. You are greeted by a man in a leather apron who has just shaved his neighbor and is now ready to open your vein or amputate your finger. My friend, welcome to the barber surgeon. In the Middle Ages, there was a clear distinction. Real doctors were learned men who read Latin treatises, studied the stars and urine, but they never stained their hands with blood. Cutting flesh was considered a dirty business, beneath the dignity of a high mind. Therefore, all the manual abuse from beard trimming to craniotomy fell on the shoulders of ordinary barbers. The main tool of such a specialist was bloodletting. In any unclear situation, be it plague, a fracture, or depression, the barber would advise letting out the bad blood. It was believed that illnesses were caused by an imbalance of the 4 humors in the body, and there was usually too much blood. You would be seated on a chair, given a pole to bulge your veins, your arm would be cut, and a liter or 2 of blood would be drained into a copper basin. The very same red and white pole we see in barbershops today is a historical symbol. White stripes represent bandages, and red stripes represent blood flowing through them. But if bloodletting seemed like a piece of cake, then leeches came into play. Dozens of them would be applied to the sore spot. These living pumps were supposed to suck out the infection. Barbers cherished their leeches, considering them their best assistants, and used them repeatedly, transferring infections from one patient to another with incredible speed. Amputations and surgeries were performed without any semblance of anesthesia. At best, you'd be given a stick to chew on, or a jug of cheap wine would be poured down your throat. Surgeons had to work with lightning speed. Speed was prized over precision. If you could lop off a leg into minutes, you were a medical star. Wounds were cauterized with red-hot irons or doused with boiling resin to stop the bleeding. Shocking? Absolutely. But for the time, this was the pinnacle of technology. The most astonishing thing is that barbers were a kind of engineers of the human body. They knew nothing about infections and germs. They didn't wash their instruments after the previous client, but it was they, through trial and error, who accumulated knowledge about the structure of muscles and bones. Life in the hands of a man with a razor was a lottery, where the odds of winning diminished with every drop of bloodshed. But even if you escaped the surgeon's knife, danger lurked where you least expected it, at the dinner table, where fragrant spices could conceal something far more sinister than simply stale produce. And it gets even more interesting. Imagine a sumptuous feast in a baron's castle. The tables are laden with game, servants can barely keep up with the flow of goblets, and the air is literally permeated with the heavy, almost intoxicating aroma of cloves, ginger, and pepper. You take a piece of meat, and it seems so spicy that your tongue begins to go numb. A popular tale from the future pops into your head. They add so many spices to mask the stench of spoiled beef that doesn't have a refrigerator. My friend, it's time to debunk one of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages. The idea that people of that era ate rotten meat, covering it with tons of pepper, is a huge misconception. In fact, it was quite the opposite. First of all, spices were incredibly expensive back then. A pound of black pepper could cost as much as a craftsman's yearly wage, and a pinch of saffron could buy a fine horse. Spices were a status symbol, powdered gold. Would a wealthy feudal lord spend a fortune to save a piece of stinking meat for 3 pennies? Of course not. If the meat went bad, it was given to the dogs or thrown away, and a new bull was slaughtered for the baron. Eating rotten meat was life-threatening, and medieval people, contrary to stereotypes, understood this perfectly well. Secondly, they had excellent preservation methods without any electricity. Meat was salted, smoked, dried, and marinated in vinegar so skillfully that it could be stored for months. Why then did they so fanatically sprinkle spices on everything, even wine and fish? The answer lies in the dietetics of the time. Medieval doctors relied on the doctrine of humors temperaments. Meat was considered to be inherently cold and wet, and to be properly digested in the stomach imagined as a boiling cauldron, it needed to be warmed up with hot, dry spices. This was medicine elevated to the rank of culinary art. Furthermore, spices were a way to show guests, "I'm so rich that my cook pours a fortune into the sauce." This was the expensive rich of the time. The more your table smelled of an Eastern bazaar, the greater your prestige. The most exquisite dishes were literally drowned in sugar and cinnamon, turning the roast into a kind of dessert. But there was a dark side to this gastronomic madness. The poor, who couldn't afford pepper, ate simple and healthy food. Brown bread, beans, onions, and cabbage. Ironically, their diet was much healthier than that of the nobility, who suffered from gout and obesity while devouring kilograms of spiced meat. Life at the aristocrats' table was a display of power and wealth, concealed behind a cloud of expensive aromas. But as soon as you stepped out of the dining room onto the city street, all the aromas of the East instantly evaporated, giving way to a reality that left you literally dizzy. Let's move on. Imagine you're invited to a gala dinner at a wealthy merchant's house, or even to the castle of a local count. The host's pride and joy is displayed on the table: dazzlingly shiny goblets, heavy dishes, and pitchers. This isn't gold, which is too soft and expensive, nor is it the common wood of the peasantry. This is poor silver tin mixed with lead. You drink a tart wine that seems unusually sweet and pleasant, snack on succulent meat, and feel on top of the world. My friend, you've just voluntarily consumed a dose of slow poison. If you've ever wondered why medieval rulers often suffered from fits of uncontrollable anger, melancholy, or strange cramps, the answer may lie in their kitchen cabinets. Lead poisoning was an invisible killer that ravaged the health of the aristocracy for years. The problem was a chemical reaction. When sour wine or fruit juice was poured into pewter vessels with a high lead content, the lead began to leach out and migrate into the drink. Lead acetate formed, which was called lead sugar at the time. It truly did impart a pleasant sweet taste to cheap or sour wine. People even deliberately added lead filings to barrels to correct the drink, unaware that each cup brought them closer to the grave. The symptoms accumulated over years. First, strange abdominal pains, which doctors attributed to bad winds. Then came pallor, weakness in the arms, and finally, the most terrifying, damage to the nervous system. Insomnia turned into hallucinations, and a rational person turned paranoid. Historians suspect that the madness of some kings was not a hereditary affliction, but the result of using luxurious lead dinnerware and cosmetics based on white lead. Even the water wasn't safe. Wealthy cities and monasteries began building water systems made of lead pipes. As long as the water was hard and the pipes were coated with limescale, everything was more or less tolerable. But as soon as the water softened, the lead entered the bodies of the lucky owners of modern technology. The poor, meanwhile, continued to eat from simple wooden bowls and drink from clay mugs. Their lives were filthy, but almost lead-free. Ironically, luxury was deadly. Death at the dinner table was quiet. It didn't smell of rot or scream in pain, it simply slowly shut down the mind and body. But while real dangers lurked in dishes, in their dreams and legends, medieval people sought salvation in creatures so wondrous that they were willing to give up their entire fortune for a piece of their body. The following fact will definitely surprise you. Imagine the treasury of a powerful monarch or the office of a grand inquisitor. Among gold bars and silken cloths, on a velvet cushion, lies the most valuable item in the collection: a long, spiraling, dazzling white horn. This is no mere ornament. Its owner believes that if poison is added to his cup, this horn will become clouded with sweat or change color, saving his life. This is the horn of a unicorn, a symbol of purity and absolute power, worth more than 10 prosperous villages, including their inhabitants, livestock, and lands. My friend, belief in unicorns in the Middle Ages was not a beautiful fairy tale for children. It was an indisputable scientific fact and the basis of a black market for luxury goods. People of that time were absolutely certain that somewhere at the ends of the earth, in the distant lands of India or Ethiopia, these majestic beasts lived. And if they existed, then their body parts must possess magical properties. The main property of alicorn, as the horn was called, was believed to be its ability to neutralize any poison. In an era when political disputes were often settled with a drop of arsenic in wine, the demand for the antidote was colossal. Kings commissioned goblets carved from unicorn horn or simply kept a small shard to touch their food with before meals. But where did these horns come from if unicorns, as we know, don't exist? This is where the stern northern sailors, the Vikings, and later the Norwegian and Icelandic whalers come into play. They brought back to Europe the tusks of narwhals, Arctic whales, whose teeth grow into a long, spiraling horn. The sailors guarded the origin of these tusks like the apple of their eye. They told tales of the difficulty of catching a unicorn. The beast was so ferocious that only a virgin, at whose knees it would bow its head, could tame it. The price of these horns was exorbitant. In the inventories of French kings, one such horn was valued at 100,000 gold cus. For comparison, for that amount of money, one could build a small castle or equip an entire army. Elizabeth I Tudor late in her reign purchased a unicorn horn for £10,000 sterling, a sum equal to the value of an estate. Medieval apothecaries ground fragments of narwhal tusks into powder and sold it for several times its weight in gold. It was prescribed for everything from plague and fever to chest diseases and despondency. People believed they were drinking a particle of a divine being, when in reality they were ingesting ordinary calcium from a whale's tooth. The funniest thing is that when skeptics tried to verify the horn's authenticity, they used the scientific method of the time. They drew a circle on the ground around the horn and placed a spider inside. It was believed that if the horn was genuine, the spider would be unable to cross the line and would die from the horn's sacredness. If the spider escaped, it meant the horn was fake, for example, made from mammoth or walrus tusk. As you can imagine, narwhals passed this test brilliantly simply by chance, and the myth lived on. Belief in miracles helped people in the Middle Ages cope with the horrors of reality. But while they searched for unicorns during the day, at night their lives were subject to a rhythm that would seem the height of madness to modern people, as their sleep was torn to pieces. And it gets even more interesting. Imagine, it's midnight. Outside the window of your medieval home, pitch darkness, broken only by the howling wind. You wake up, but not from a nightmare or the need to go to the bathroom. You feel refreshed and energized. You sit up in bed, light a candle, or simply remain in the darkness. To your right, your wife is stretching. To your left, your bedmate is fidgeting. Remember the shared beds from point 7. You begin quietly discussing tomorrow's plans, praying, or even visiting your neighbor, whose window is also lit up with a glimmer of light. My friend, if you think 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep is a natural human need, a medieval peasant would have looked at you as if you were sick. Back then, humanity lived in a biphasic sleep pattern. It was so commonplace that the authors of the time didn't even explain what it was as natural as breathing. The first sleep began immediately after sunset. People went to bed early because candles were expensive, and working in the dark was impossible. Round midnight or 1 a.m., a period called watch began. It lasted 1 to 2 hours. During this time, the world came alive. People read if they could, had sex. It was believed that children conceived during this period would be especially strong, stole apples from a neighbor's orchard, or simply reflected on the meaning of life. Doctors of the time even wrote treatises on the best philosophical thoughts to ponder during this midnight break. Then came the second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This morning sleep was considered the deepest and most restorative. Why do we sleep differently now? Industrial lighting changed everything. When city streets were flooded with gaslights and electricity came into homes, night ceased to be a time of silence and danger. Capitalism and the work schedule have forced us to compress rest into a single, monolithic block. But research by modern sleep scientists shows that if a person is deprived of artificial light for a couple of weeks, their body returns to a medieval rhythm. We begin to wake at midnight, feeling a strange surge of creativity. For medieval people, night was not just a time to unwind, it was a space of freedom. While the Inquisition and the Lord slept, ordinary people lived their secret nightlife. But as soon as morning arrived and the workday began, quiet nighttime conversations gave way to such unbridled and bloody revelry that modern football fans would seem like an institution for noblewomen in comparison. The following fact will definitely surprise you. Imagine a fine Sunday in a 12th century English or French village. Church service has ended, and the entire male population, young and old, has gathered in the market square. The atmosphere is tense. In the center of the crowd appears an inflated pig's bladder, covered in rough leather. This is a ball. But don't be so quick to picture a neat lawn, referees blowing whistles, and yellow cards. What you're seeing is mob football, which resembled more a disorganized war than a competitive sport. My friend, if you think modern football is sometimes overly brutal, the medieval version of this game would make you squint in horror. There were practically no rules. More precisely, there was only one. Get the ball into the opponent's goal, which was usually the church gate in a neighboring village or a designated tree on the edge of a forest. The distance between the goals could be several kilometers. Hundreds of people participated in the game simultaneously. Entire parishes would go head-to-head. The ball could be kicked, carried, thrown, or hidden under clothing. But most importantly, almost anything was allowed to stop the opponent. Fists, elbows, tripping, and even sticks were used. Participants smashed through thorny bushes, swam across icy rivers, and climbed the walls of houses, breaking down fences and smashing windows along the way. For medieval peasants, whose lives consisted of endless, back-breaking labor, this type of football was a legitimate way to let off steam and vent pent-up aggression on their neighbors. It was pure chaos. By the end of a match, which could last until sunset, the field, or rather, the entire area resembled a battlefield. Dozens of knocked-out teeth, broken ribs, bloodied noses, and dislocated limbs were an obligatory attribute of the fun. Fatalities sometimes occurred, but they were usually attributed to God's will or accidents. The authorities were horrified. King after king issued decrees banning this demonic pastime. For example, in 1314, the English King Edward officially banned football in London under penalty of imprisonment, declaring that great evil is being caused in the city by the noise produced by the crush of large footballs. Why did monarchs dislike the sport so much? It's simple. They feared that their subjects, instead of practicing archery, which was useful for war, were wasting their energy chasing pig bladders. Moreover, such gatherings often degenerated into actual riots. But the people were adamant. Football continued to thrive underground, on the outskirts, and in remote villages. People were willing to risk their freedom and health for this wild sense of community and adrenaline. It was from this bloody mess that modern football and rugby later emerged. The life of the common man was rough and violent, like this match. But even in this world of violence, there were things that could instantly distinguish a person from the crowd, making them almost untouchable. And sometimes it wasn't a crown or a sword at all, but a tiny item of clothing that we don't even notice today. Imagine walking down a narrow street in medieval Paris or London. The second floors of half-timbered houses loom overhead, almost touching and blocking out the sky. Suddenly, a shutter bursts open, and someone's voice shrilly cries out, "Gardez-vous!" From the French "Gare l'eau, beware of the water." You have exactly 1 second to jump aside, or the contents of a chamber pot, spilled right out the window, will end up on your luxurious cloak or, worse, on your head. My friend, if you thought medieval cities were like fairy tale sets from Disney, I hasten to disappoint you. They smelled so bad that a modern person would likely pass out within minutes. Sewers. Forget that word. At best, a shallow gutter was dug in the middle of the street, collecting everything from rainwater to slaughterhouse waste and human excrement. But why murder windows? Space was at a premium in medieval cities. Houses were built close together, and the streets were so narrow that a cart could barely pass through. Sanitary regulations. No one heard of them. The easiest way to dispose of trash or the contents of a toilet was to throw it out the window. It was believed that the next heavy rain would wash all this stuff into the river. But it didn't always rain, and the contents of pots accumulated under windows, turning into a foul-smelling sludge that slowly trickled under the feet of passersby. Incidentally, we owe the emergence of some elements of gentlemanly etiquette to this tradition. Do you know why a man should walk on the side of the roadway, allowing a lady to pass closer to the walls of the houses? This used to be vital. The wall and cornice offered some semblance of protection from surprises from above, while anyone walking on the edge bore the brunt of the splashes from the gutter. But the stench wasn't the only problem. This aromatic environment was an ideal haven for rats and flies. People believed in the miasma theory that diseases were transmitted through bad smells. And they were right, to a certain extent. Wherever there was a stench, infection really did flourish. To somehow breathe, wealthy city dwellers carried pomanders laced like metal balls containing perfumed fabrics or ambergris. They pressed them to their noses as they passed through particularly juicy neighborhoods. Butchers slaughtered cattle right on the streets, and the blood flowed into the same gutters. Tanners used urine, remember it, from the first point in huge open vats. The entire city was a gigantic chemical and biological reactor. Yet, people lived, loved, and even held feasts amidst this chaos. But even behind the castle's closed doors, where the air was slightly cleaner, a silent death lurked, hidden in the most precious piece of furniture, their own dishes. And things get even more interesting. Imagine walking through a market in 14th century London. People pass you in simple wool shirts, belted with simple cords. But suddenly the crowd parts, and a man appears whose doublet is literally strewn with tiny, glittering dots. They line the sleeves, flow from the neck to the hem, and even decorate the slits on the sides. You take a closer look and realize these are buttons. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them. And this man isn't simply buttoned, he's sewn into his wealth. My friend, to us, a button is a penny-pinching trifle, something we don't notice until it falls off. But in the Middle Ages, the button ushered in a true sexual and social revolution. Before their widespread introduction, clothing was baggy. People simply wrapped themselves in pieces of fabric or wore tunics similar to today's oversized t-shirts. To ensure a proper fit, clothes had to be literally sewn on each morning and then unsewn at night. And then they writhed. At first, they were simply decorative beads, but when tailors figured out how to cut buttonholes, the world changed. Buttons allowed clothing to hug the body. For the first time in history, men could emphasize broad shoulders and a narrow waist, and women, their curves. The church, of course, was horrified, calling buttons the devil's windows through which temptation could enter the world. But it wasn't just about temptation. Buttons became the ultimate measure of a person's purse. Noblemen ordered them made of gold, silver, and ivory, adorned with precious stones and enamel. There's a famous case where a single formal suit worn by the French King Francis I already toward the end of his reign contained over 13,000 gold buttons. It was a walking bank. If a nobleman lacked the cash to pay for a tavern meal or a loss at dice, he could simply rip a couple of buttons off his sleeve and throw them on the table. Sumptuary laws strictly regulated who was allowed to wear how many buttons. A commoner who dared to sew an extra row of tin buttons onto his jacket could face imprisonment or a hefty fine for impudence beyond rank. Buttons altered one's posture. To fasten the long row of small buttons on the back or narrow sleeves, gentlemen required the assistance of servants. Thus, the mere presence of buttons said, "I am so rich that I don't need to dress myself." It was an era where functionality took a backseat to conspicuous consumption. The life of an aristocrat was glittering and tight, bound by golden clasps. But if you think this glitter was limited to clothes, and these people lived in gloomy gray stone boxes, you're sorely mistaken. A real medieval castle looked nothing like what we're used to seeing in movies. And it gets even more interesting. Imagine approaching a famous castle, such as the Tower of London or the Austerchâteau de Chillon in Switzerland. In your mind's eye, inspired by Hollywood movies, it's a majestic yet gloomy mass of gray stone, covered in moss and exuding dampness. You expect to see the austere aesthetic of minimalism. But when you open your eyes, you gasp in surprise. Before you is not a gray fortress, but something reminiscent of a decorated gingerbread house or a fairground booth. My friend, one of the most visual myths about the Middle Ages is the grayness of stone. In fact, medieval people adored bright colors and hated bare stone. For them, gray was a symbol of poverty, incompleteness, and chaos. Therefore, any self-respecting baron or king would have the outer walls of their castles whitewashed and then painted in what we would consider the wildest colors. Castles shone dazzlingly white in the sun, their towers might be painted bright red or blue, and the walls were covered with murals depicting coats of arms, saints, or hunting scenes. The same was true of cathedrals. The statues on the facades of Notre Dame de Paris weren't sand-colored, they were painted flesh tones, with bright red lips and golden hair. The Middle Ages was an era of visual eye-popping. Inside, everything was even more radical. Stone walls were covered with vibrant tapestries not only for warmth but also to hide the boring stone. Ceilings were painted to resemble starry skies, and floors were covered with fragrant herbs and flowers. Why do we see them gray now? Time, rain, and wind have washed away the paint over the centuries, and 19th century restorers, overcome by Romanticism, decided that harsh stone looked nobler and abandoned the former variegation. We look at the skeletons of buildings, thinking they are their skin. Medieval man lived in a world that screamed with color, trying to drown out the fear of the grayness of death. But while everything outside sparkled and shimmered, behind closed bedroom doors, things took place that today would be called magical realism, as even the birth of a child was transformed into a complex ritual involving stones and secret amulets. Imagine, you're a young woman expecting your first child. You live in a world where every other woman in labor risks not seeing the dawn, and medicine is a mixture of prayer and blacksmithing. When contractions begin, it's not a doctor who rushes into your room, but a whole crowd of women. Your mother, your mother-in-law, neighbors, and the local midwife. But they bring with them not clean sheets, but a strange assortment of objects. The dried umbilical cord of another child, a snake tongue which is actually a fossilized shark tooth, and a heavy calfskin belt inscribed with biblical texts. My friend, welcome to the world of magical midwifery. In the Middle Ages, childbirth was a battlefield between life and death, where the main weapon was not sterility, but symbolism. To unleash the baby, every lock in the house was unlocked, every knot in clothing was untied, and even hair was unbraided. It was believed that any physical obstacle could magically block the baby's exit. The most prized artifacts were birthing belts. These were long strips of parchment or cloth, blessed in the church, inscribed with the names of saints and special incantations. The belt was tightly wrapped around the belly of the woman in labor. It was believed to create a spiritual shield that warded off demons, who were just waiting for the right moment to swap the baby for a deformed changeling. If labor dragged on, methods became increasingly exotic. The woman might be given a piece of the bone of a saint to chew on, or have an eagle stone gothite applied to her thigh. This stone, found in an eagle's nest, was believed to have the power to pull out the fetus. But the most horrific was the attitude toward pain. The church taught that the pain of childbirth was direct punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. Trying to alleviate it was considered almost sacrilegious. And yet, women helped each other secretly, using herbal infusions that today we would call mild narcotics, or simply giving the mother wine until she was half conscious. As soon as the baby was born, a new series of rituals began. First, it was washed in salt water or wine. This was believed to harden the skin and ward off evil spirits. Then it was carried to the baptismal font as quickly as possible. After all, an unbaptized infant, in the medieval mind, was defenseless against the forces of darkness. Life began with pain, fear, and magical spells. But if this child survived and grew to the age where it could hold a spoon, the strangest ordeal of life awaited it: a trial where the defendant might not be a human being, but a pig or a swarm of locusts. The following fact will surely surprise you. Imagine a city courthouse, and in the dock sits a pig. It's dressed in a human jacket and pants, and its hooves are bound. A lawyer stands next to it, earnestly reading its justification, citing the Bible and ancient laws. Across the street sits a stern, robed judge, and a crowd of townspeople has gathered in the courtroom, waiting with bated breath for the verdict. Is the pig guilty of stealing apples or, God forbid, of assaulting a child? My friend, welcome to medieval animal trials. This is no joke or the ravings of a mad chronicler. From the 13th to the 18th centuries, hundreds of official trials of pigs, cows, rats, locusts, and even weevils took place in Europe. For medieval people, the world was a single whole under the rule of God, meaning animals, like people, bore moral responsibility for their actions. The most famous case occurred in Falaise, France, in 1386. A pig was accused of maiming a baby. The trial lasted 9 days. The pig was assigned a state lawyer, who tried to prove that the animal acted instinctively, not with malice. But the judge was adamant. The sentence: death. To emphasize the seriousness of the crime, the pig was dressed in human clothing and publicly hanged in the marketplace in front of other pigs, who had been brought in specifically for a lesson. But if the pig case is clear, how do you judge insects? This is where the church came into play. When locusts or caterpillars devoured crops, they were summoned to the ecclesiastical court. First, they were sent an official written notice which was read in the margins. If the insects did not leave, they were assigned a lawyer. In one such case, a lawyer defended caterpillars, arguing that they were God's creatures and had a right to food. The court sympathized with the situation and allocated a special plot of land for the caterpillars to eat grass without disturbing the farmer's crops. Those who disobeyed the order and remained in the fields were officially excommunicated. Why was all this necessary? For people of that time, such courts were a way to bring order to a chaotic world. If evil occurred, someone had to answer for it. This gave a sense of control. Even if your crops were eaten by beetles, you could defeat them legally. Life in the Middle Ages was absurd, cruel, and incredibly vivid. We've explored 21 facts, delving into the darkest and strangest corners of history.